Hello, everyone. It's so good to be leading another session. A little bit about me. My name is Ozy Aloziem. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am a social worker. Previously, I was the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Manager for the Denver Public Library System, but transitioned out of that role in 2021 at this point. It's hard to keep straight. One of the things that I noticed during my time in that role, because I was on our senior exec team and was just privy to a lot of the concerns and a lot of the challenges that staff and our communities were facing, is that it really is of the utmost priority now, I think more than ever before, for us to have a firm understanding of trauma and how it could be manifesting, as well as how we as individuals who are interacting with folks who are experiencing trauma, whether that be trauma from their lived experiences, trauma because of the pandemic, trauma because of what we're seeing on the news, right? A lot of things are happening to us. And so being able to understand how that can impact an individual, what we can do to still provide excellent services, right? And also be sure that we're taking care of ourselves as we're doing that is really what my passion is these days. I am now a full-time professor at the School of Social Work in Denver, where I also teach trauma-informed social work, as well as other classes. And I started an LLC specifically to support individuals and organizations in understanding what not only a trauma-informed approach is, but also what a healing-centered approach is, and how we can pivot how we approach wellness in our individual lives and in our workplaces in order to take care of ourselves and to support and take care of our communities. So that is a little bit about me. I'm going to move us into our agenda. Well, before we get into the agenda, rather, actually, I want to sort of land us in our bodies. As I've mentioned, there are a lot of things that are happening to us and around us. One of the things that I have done in the last few years is receive my yoga teaching certification, as well as my mindfulness and somatic certification, and I'm working on my trauma-informed somatic and yoga certification. I want to ground us and land us in this moment, right? I know that a lot of things are happening around us, are happening inside of us. I don't know what happened to you even earlier today, but we're bringing all of that into the space. And what that means is that we are constantly dysregulated. And I say that for my own self to remind myself that I need to do things to regulate, but also so that I can interact with people with more grace and more compassion, knowing that we are all doing the best that we can as all of these compounding traumatic things and stressful things are happening. And so one of the things that I really think is important as part of a trauma-informed approach is to be able to, whenever we're starting meetings or workshops or classes, to be able to land in our bodies. And I do that through a number of different sort of tools. Today, I want to introduce you to a grounding exercise. It's a grounding and awareness exercise that I find particularly powerful, and it draws upon the five senses. This approach or this method can help calm and orient your attention to the present space, right? So that we can be as engaged as we can and as open to receiving information. I will be sharing quite a bit of information in rather quick-ish, just so that we can get through everything. And I want you to be able to receive that, right? Knowing that there is going to be a recording that you can come back to, but also knowing that it's important to just land in the present. And this tool is also really helpful for managing stress and anxiety, right? It's a tool for leaning into your senses when you might feel overstimulated, overactivated, or agitated, or if you just want to practice mindfulness and awareness. I'm going to invite you to find a seat that feels good, right? You might want to readjust how you're sitting. You might want to lift up your feet and place them on the ground. It's a tool that's going to activate 5 of your senses. And if any of your senses are not available to you for whatever reason, that is okay. I'm going to invite you to lean into the other senses that are available to you. I want to remind you all that you have choice. We'll talk about the importance of choice in a trauma-informed approach. But what that means is that this is an invitation. If you don't want to engage in this mindful moment, that is a-okay. It'll take about 3 minutes, maybe go and do something for the next 3 minutes that feels grounding and soothing for you and your body in this moment. I'm also going to invite you to keep your eyes open during this exercise. Sometimes I do mindfulness practices where your eyes are closed, but I also know that for not everyone feels safe when their eyes are closed. Sometimes, in fact, when we close our eyes, it could be more activating depending on where we are and depending on what we've experienced. And so I don't want to assume that that's something that's going to make you feel soothed or calm in this moment. I'm just going to invite you to do whatever feels good. And so the first thing I want you to do after you've sort of repositioned yourself in your chair, or if you're standing, found a stance that feels good, is to just check in with yourself on a scale of 1 being not at all stressed to 10 being extremely stressed. How would you rate your stress right now and how you currently feel? You don't need to tell me how you're feeling or to share that number with anyone. Just check in with yourself, and to do that with a gentle awareness, being conscious of what's coming up for you, but not judging it, not assigning any meaning or value to it, just being aware of how you're feeling right now in this moment. And once you have that number, I'm going to invite you to take a few calming breaths. Perhaps you might breathe in for 3 seconds, hold for 3 seconds, then exhale for 3 seconds. Perhaps you might inhale for a count of 2, and then exhale on a count of 4. There are many approaches to breathing that can help calm and activate us in different ways. So whatever breath feels good to you in this moment, I'm going to invite you to do that. And then, if it's available to you, I'm going to invite you to look around your space, wherever you are in this moment, and try to find 5 things that you can see in your immediate surroundings. And say them either out loud to yourself if that's available, or you can keep them in your head. For example, I see a jar of pens and pencils on my table in my office. I see my cat lounging in the sun on his bed. I see rays of sun shining through the curtains in my office. Think about how each thing looks to you and acknowledge them again out loud or in your head. Now, I want to invite you to attempt to notice 4 things that you can feel, remembering to say them out loud if possible. And again, outside of my voice, right? For example, you could say, I feel the soft cushion of the chair that I'm sitting on. I feel my sweaty palms against my knees. I feel a cool breeze coming through an open window. I feel the fabric of my sweatshirt against my skin. And maybe if you feel comfortable, spend a moment touching these items, paying particular attention to the way that these objects feel in your hand or against your skin. Notice the textures and even the temperature of the surrounding environment. Now, I'm going to invite you to name 3 things that you can hear. Take a few moments to listen to any noises that you can hear inside your immediate surroundings outside of my voice. For example, I hear the sound of traffic passing outside my window. I hear the birds in my neighbor's bird feeder. Maybe you hear the hum of the air conditioning unit. Let those sounds remind you of where you are. And again, if it's possible, say those 3 things out loud or maybe just in your head. Now I'm going to invite you to name 2 things that you can smell in your surroundings. So maybe you smell the freshly brewed coffee that you made to pick yourself up this afternoon. Or maybe you smell lavender scented soap that you used to wash your hands last. When you notice that fragrance, take a deep breath and note its qualities. Is it spicy? Is it sweet? Is it citrusy? And again, as you notice those scents, say them out loud. And lastly, I'm going to invite you to name 1 thing that you can taste right now in this moment. And again, say it out loud if the situation allows. So you could say, I taste the lingering ginger and lemon in the tea that I'm drinking, or I taste the residue of the sandwich that I had for lunch. And once you've named that for yourself, check in again. On a scale of 1 not at all stressed to 10 extremely stressed, how would you rate your stress after completing this exercise? And again, do that without judgment, just awareness, right? Use this as data. Perhaps you shifted a little bit. Perhaps you didn't shift at all. But what's important is you just spent the last few minutes engaging in exercise to self-regulate, to take care of you, your body, and your mind. And I know that orienting doesn't work for everyone. Sometimes these grounding practices can feel woo-woo or not relevant, or they can even overwhelm you. But there are a number of other resources that you can tap into whenever you feel stressed, anxious, overwhelmed, and whenever you just want to give yourself that bit of self-care. And so now I'm going to move us into the bulk of what we'll be talking about, although that is me modeling what a trauma-informed approach to starting a community space, right? Knowing that we could be coming in with a host of different things. And I'm not going to assume, right, what you might be carrying or what you might be experiencing or how you might be feeling. What I am going to do is ensure that I do my work to at least start us in as good of a way as we can. And so with that being said, today, these are the things that we'll cover. What is trauma? Why should we care about trauma? What is a trauma-informed approach, and what does a trauma-informed organization look like and feel like? What is trauma-informed community engagement, and how do we put that into practice? Also knowing that as we interact with different communities, different staff members, right, different patrons, we are going to be impacted by the trauma that we come across. So how do we take care in that work? What is trauma? Trauma, as defined by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, describes it as individual trauma results from an event, a series of events, a set of circumstances experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, with lasting adverse effects on the individual's function and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So the focus on events places the cause of trauma in the environment, right? And not some defect or deficit in the individual. And that's really important, right? That's one of the foundational aspects of a trauma-informed approach. It's shifting from what is wrong with you, but what has happened to you. The focus on experience highlights the fact that not every individual is going to experience the same events as traumatic, or even experience trauma in the same ways, right? And so what might be traumatic to one person might not be traumatic to other people as well, because trauma is really what happens in response to the event, right? How our bodies and our minds shift or fundamentally change in response to something that we've experienced. And the identification on a broad range of potential effects reminds us that our response to trauma has to be holistic. It's not enough to just focus on symptoms or behaviors. Our goal is to support ourselves and our community members, our patrons, in living a satisfying life. And so the 3 E's of trauma then are an event that is experienced that has some sort of potential adverse effect that can be lasting. And so there are different kinds of trauma. And this isn't an exhaustive list, but just so we are aware of what we could be dealing with ourselves, as well as what our patrons and communities could be navigating, there are some distinct kinds of trauma. So we've got acute trauma, which is a singular, unexpected event that threatens one's life or safety. So this could come after experiencing a natural disaster, after seeing a bad car accident or being in one, or even witnessing violence. We've got chronic trauma, which is extended or ongoing exposure to events that threatens one's life or sense of safety. This could be things like experiencing domestic violence, emotional abuse, witnessing mass shootings continuously, being a person with a marginalized identity, existing and working and living in oppressive and dominant spaces, housing instability, poverty, all of these things are considered chronic trauma. And then we've got complex trauma, which is sort of a combination of acute and chronic trauma. And so it occurs when someone experiences prolonged exposure to traumatic events. And it encompasses both the exposure to multiple chronic or reoccurring traumatic experiences, as well as the wide range and long-term impacts of these experiences. And it emphasizes how difficult it can be for a person to continue to adapt and survive, right, and endure in the face of this adversity. So thinking about people who are raised in abusive homes and then go on in their adulthood to experience substance misuse or substance use, or experience homelessness and then are assaulted on the street, right? Or consider racially marginalized individuals who deal with micro assaults, macro assault, and ongoing anxiety and fear and stress because of what they see in the news. And then we've got historic trauma. And historical trauma refers to the collective and cumulative emotional wounding across generations that results from a cataclysmic event targeting a community. So it is multi-generational. It's experienced by demographics, groups of people and families who have been oppressed either because of displacement or because they've been oppressed over a long period of time through genocide, things like that. And that trauma is held both personally and collectively and is transmitted across generations. So as a result, individuals who haven't maybe necessarily experienced the trauma are able to feel the effects of that event several generations later. Some groups of folks who've experienced historic trauma, we can think of Indigenous folks in the United States, Jewish individuals, descendants of enslaved people. So historic trauma is about both what has happened in the past, as well as what is still currently happening now. Then we've got intergenerational trauma, which is similar to historic trauma, but is sort of more situated in household in some ways. So it refers to trauma that is passed from a trauma survivor to their descendants. So it's not necessarily the result of a cataclysmic event, right? It can be growing up in a household where a caretaker had dependency on alcohol. And so people who experience this kind of intergenerational trauma may experience symptoms, reactions, and emotional and psychological effects from the trauma experienced by those members of their previous generations. So that's not just limited to parents or grandparents, but people further in their lineage as well. And so it's looking at how trauma might be also passed on in descendants. We've got collective trauma, which we are all experiencing right now. And this refers to the psychological reactions to a traumatic event that affects and impacts an entire society. So things like the pandemic, right? The increase in gun violence in the United States, a lot of undermining of protections and rights of marginalized individuals, attacks on reproductive justice and what that means for different communities. So collective trauma doesn't only represent historical event, right? But it's collective memory of an awful event that happened to a group of people. And then we've got vicarious trauma, which we'll talk about towards the end of the presentation, and it refers to the impact of exposure to traumatic stories and the impacts and the experiences of others. So these are the different types of trauma, and maybe you identify with a few of them, having experienced them, and maybe it's giving you language to what you sort of intuitively knew, but didn't know there was a word or a term for. And it's just important to be aware of the different kinds of trauma, because trauma looks different and is experienced differently. So one of the things that's important to also know is that trauma can change your brain, right? From the way that you make decisions to your immediate subconscious response to the world around you. And part of the reason it can be really difficult to overcome or to be resilient in the face of trauma is that it's going to affect different areas of your brain at once. And I'm not going to go into the neurobiology of it all, but I do think it's important to note a few things, right? And so we've got the amygdala, here, right? And this is where your emotional and instinctual centers are. We've got your hippocampus, which controls your memory, and we've got the prefrontal cortex. And this is responsible for regulating emotions and impulses. All of these things work together to regulate and manage stress. And so when someone has experienced a traumatic event and then is reminded of a traumatic experience, your amygdala, your emotional and survival center, they go into overdrive and they act as if you're experiencing that trauma for the first time. Your prefrontal cortex also becomes suppressed. So then you're less capable of controlling your fear. You're sort of stuck in a purely reactive state. And then trauma also leads to reduced activity in the hippocampus. The function of the hippocampus is to help us distinguish between the past and the present. So in other words, your brain can't tell the difference between the actual traumatic event and your memory of it. And so it perceives the things that trigger memories of traumatic events as threats themselves. So trauma can cause people and cause brains to remain in a state of hypervigilance. It can suppress your memory and your impulse control, and it can trap you in a constant state of emotional reactivity, right? So if you think about how there is an increase in people just being wild in public, right? And there are more fights in the workplaces, or you might be feeling more reactive. It is because all of these things, they are getting in the way of our ability to make decisions that are rational, right? Because our brains are telling us that we are under threat, we are under attack, we are being flooded with cortisol. Another piece of trauma, right, is that it can activate different sort of responses to it, right? I like this quote: the effect of trauma on an individual can be conceptualized as a normal response to an abnormal situation, right? If we think about trauma, it is abnormal. And so we, of course, are going to react in ways that are sort of inherent to our physiology, right, and our evolutionary ways of being in response to that threat to safety. And so this slide lists 3 sets of quote unquote problems that are often attributed to people that we might be working with, right, or that we might be serving. And how these behaviors might be a survival mechanism for fight, or freeze response, right? Fight being, okay, if I feel activated, I'm going to push back, right? I'm going to act more aggressively in some ways. Flight being like, I'm going to completely abandon the situation. I'm out. I'm just going to leave. I'm going to shut down. And then freeze is, I'm going to acquiesce. I might not know what to say in the moment and shut down and just stay there versus fleeing or versus responding. And so some things you might hear is that customer is really non-compliant or combative. Or are they struggling to regain or hold on to their personal power, right? The second is a fight response. Sometimes we might notice that our colleagues are emotionally withdrawn, they've disengaged, and we might label them as resistant or uncooperative, right? But maybe their disengagement, their withdrawing, is a response to having experienced the trauma that we're all experiencing, as well as the traumas that they might be experiencing in their own individual lives. And then the third is the freeze response. And so people who give in too easily to authority might be lazy, or might be identified as passive or lazy or unmotivated. Or maybe their trauma response is that they give in to those in power when they're feeling activated or triggered, right? Their innate response to that is to just put their hands up and let whoever take the lead. And so many of the people we serve, many of the people we work with have survived circumstances that we may not even be able to imagine. And what we might often label as pathological might be the very things that help them to survive, right? Because when we think about how we respond to trauma, what happens is that we employ survival tactics, right? And depending on how long that trauma, we're experiencing that trauma, we might hold on to survival instincts that were at one point really helpful and useful and important because they helped us survive. But if that trauma is no longer a threat, that survival instinct, that survival response, that trauma response might actually be ineffective and might be hindering us. And so it's thinking about how we don't pathologize anything, but approach it with an understanding that people are doing the best that they can to survive, right? And sometimes how they survive might rub us the wrong way, might be inappropriate in certain situations and in spaces, but we don't blame the person and shame the person. We approach it with an awareness and understanding of that. And so again, when we take a trauma-informed approach, we recognize symptoms and quote unquote problem behaviors as adaptations to trauma, and how that's attached to the helplessness and the loss of control that trauma often causes. Some additional signs of trauma, and again, this isn't an exhaustive list, and even it's worth noting that none of these signs are always going to be associated with trauma. Each of these signs can be adaptations to neurobiological changes that we discussed earlier. But it's important to notice, one, how we might be experiencing trauma, but also how that can manifest. Because if we are to have a trauma-informed approach, right, we have to have an understanding of what trauma is, how it shows up, and then how people might be responding to it. So things like sensitivity to noise or being touched, maybe always expecting something bad to happen, forgetting things, either recent events or periods of one's life, forgetting important information for forms, feeling emotionally numb, lack of concentration, excessive watchfulness, anxiety, anger, shame, or sadness, some of the things that might be trauma responses. And trauma responses don't necessarily have to be negative. Beautiful things have been birthed from trauma, including new cultural practices, the creation of art and music, community connection, deepening and solidarity forming, as well as stronger, enhanced cultural pride. And so the difference between post-traumatic stress, or what happens after a traumatic experience, and post-traumatic growth, right, which is the resilience that and the transformation that happens following a traumatic event, is how the community responds and the resources it has access to. So why do I need to know about trauma? Because many people who utilize our supports and services have experienced or are experiencing trauma in their lives. Many of the people that we are trying to engage in different communities, especially communities that have been historically disinvested in and historically oppressed, they've experienced trauma, which means that you are going to be exposed to people who have experienced trauma. And you also have experienced trauma, right? And either currently or in the past. And so we need to be aware of how trauma plays a role in our interactions internally with staff as well as with the public. And when we avoid, when we overlook, when we misunderstand trauma, we can risk re-traumatizing people, right? Which then interferes with their healing process. And so it's important for us to understand it so we're not participating in the re-traumatization. And if communities are under constant trauma and they don't have tools or resources or folks who are understanding that, it can get in the way of a community's capacity to not only identify some of the challenges that they're navigating, but actually address those and plan towards a more successful future. And so I think about the work that I've been doing with organizations, right? Knowing that we're all experiencing different levels of trauma, and then trying to do work around intentional strategic planning, that can be really hard if folks are experiencing trauma and don't have tools and strategies for managing that, right? It makes it difficult to think of any kind of future outside of what we're currently experiencing. And that can hinder creative decision making as well as forward motion. So when we think about community engagement, it means building relationships between staff and the surrounding community to remove the barriers that prevent individuals from taking ownership of whatever art, science, and cultural organization is in their community. And so we tend to focus on a small, visible fraction of an individual or community instead of the full person or the full community. So that's why it's important for us to think about how complex and nuanced our communities are, how complex and nuanced the individuals that we're working with are, and how we strengthen our relationships by getting rid of the barriers to wellness, the barriers to self-agency, the barriers to one's sense of safety, security, and possibility. a bit on community trauma. So this affects social groups or neighborhoods that have been long subjected to interpersonal violence, structural violence, and historical harms. In some communities, legacy of forced displacement, historic disinvestment, and inconsistent services has created a pervasive and deep sense of distrust of new programs, staff, and city-led initiatives, while community violence has led to high levels of stress and isolation. And so research suggests that the causes of community trauma is not only the historic things, right, and that ongoing root cause of social inequity, including things like poverty, racism, sexism, oppression, ableism. It also means that the continuous erasure of culture and communities, right? The continued impacts of historical subjugation and historical disinvestment. And so that means that all of the trauma that we are all currently experiencing because of the pandemic, because of the other things that I've named, that those are exacerbated by social inequities, which is all the more reason for us to be talking about it, especially as organizations are trying to pivot around a commitment to equity, right? Understanding that part of that work is reaching communities maybe we have not had relationships in, but those communities might have experienced community trauma in the hands or at the hands of our organizations, right? Because of that historic disinvestment, because of that neglect, because of X number of reasons. And so understanding that different communities are impacted by all of these things helps us to understand how we might approach trying to engage those communities. Now I'm going to segue us into the concepts or the core principles of a trauma-informed approach. And this is important because it creates a framework for understanding how complex trauma can be, right? And this was created by a working group of researchers, practitioners, trauma survivors, and family members that convened to not only help describe and name trauma, but to think about how we can integrate that learning into our interventions, into our approaches with teaching, with serving our customers, if we're in service professions, as well as just being aware of how we might need to be taking care of ourselves and our loved ones. So what is a trauma-informed approach? It's an approach to engaging people with histories of trauma or people who've experienced trauma that recognizes the presence of trauma symptoms and acknowledges the role that trauma has played in their lives. So you don't need to be a therapist to have a trauma-informed lens or to use a trauma-informed approach. This is a holistic approach that doesn't define a person solely by one part, but recognizes the whole person. So instead of saying a homeless person, our language would shift to a person who is unhoused, a person without a home. And this shift in language then allows us to better recognize and support the assets of the individual and the potential that one has instead of their quote unquote deficits. And as I have mentioned before, right, people have different responses to trauma, and symptoms and difficult quote unquote behaviors are strategies developed to cope with that trauma. So we don't need to know why someone is reacting the way that they are, but we do need to understand that every person deserves empathy, compassion, and healing. So again, the shift is from what is wrong with you to what has happened to you. So trauma-informed arts, science, and cultural organizations, they recognize the following things: the power that an organization has as a historical institution, as well as the ways in which it has potentially used or misused and abused that power. So we must reflect on how individual and collective stories and histories and experiences have impacted the individual communities that we're engaging, as well as the relationships we might have to those communities. It also recognizes the necessity of sharing power with the community. And so the question then becomes, how does this organization, whether it is a library or a museum, how does this organization share its power equitably, effectively, and intentionally? And again, the shift from what is wrong with you to what has happened to you and what do you actually need? And there are 4 R's to a trauma-informed approach. Trauma-informed care originated in the health field, but it's now being applied to a wide range of other professions like librarianship, like social work, like education, but the 4 R's remain consistent. So the first is realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands potential paths for recovery. So this means that we understand that people's experience and their behaviors again, in the context of coping strategies designed to help survive adversity in overwhelming circumstances. The second R is recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in patrons, families, and staff, and others involved with the organization. It means that people in the organization are able to recognize the signs of trauma and the ways in which it might be gender, age, or setting specific, as well as how it may be manifested by individuals that are seeking or even providing services in these settings. The third R is responds. So responds by fully integrating our knowledge about trauma into our policies, into our procedures, and into our practices, right? So all of what I talked about the different signs of trauma, the different ways in which trauma affects the body, integrating that knowledge into all areas of our organization, as well as into all areas of community engagement. So integrating and understanding that the experiences of traumatic events impacts all people involved, whether directly or indirectly. So that means that we have to be always changing our behaviors and our practices to take into consideration the experiences of trauma among our community members and among our colleagues. And then the fourth R is resist re-traumatization, meaning that the organization seeks to resist the re-traumatization of community members, patrons, and staff. So we want to avoid unintentionally creating stressful or toxic environments that are going to actually interfere with recovery and healing in our customers, as well as the well-being of staff and the fulfillment of our mission as an organization. So those are the four R's of trauma-informed care or trauma-informed approach. Then we've got the trauma-informed care principles. And I've seen these are the core sort of 6 principles, but I've seen other organizations, other individuals add additional principles. When we think about what trauma-informed care, it is a commitment to, again, not repeat the traumatic experiences that individuals have encountered, but it's also to restore a sense of safety, power, and self-worth. And so these are the 6 principles: safety throughout the organization, staff and the people they serve feel physically and psychologically safe; trustworthiness, organizational operations and decisions are conducted with transparency, and the goal of building and maintaining trust among staff, clients, and family members of those receiving services; peer support and mutual help, integral to the organizational and service delivery approach, and is a way to build trust and establish safety and empowerment; collaboration and mutuality, recognizing that healing happens in relationships and that meaningfully sharing power and decision making is important; empowerment, voice, and choice. And so organizations are striving to ensure that both customers and patrons and staff experience choice, and that everyone's experience is going to be individualized, so their needs are going to need to be individualized. And then recognizing that there are cultural, historical, and gendered issues that have affected communities, and that we are actively moving past cultural stereotypes and bias and offering culturally responsive services, leveraging the healing value of traditional cultural connections, and recognizing and addressing historical trauma. And so I'm going to give a few examples of each. So again, safety means that the many people we serve feel both physically and psychologically safe. And we know that safety is defined by those we serve, those who can articulate what is safe for them, which means that we are actively listening to people with less power and privilege than us and taking action to repair harm when it happens. So it's recognizing that safety looks different depending on your role, depending on your situation, depending on your identities and your personal history. And the best thing that you can do is ask individuals what makes them feel safe and unsafe. And so this may mean for patrons, maximizing control over their own lives, providing space for them to contribute to the services that are being indicating what services need to be taking place, clearly marked entrances and exit signs in case of an emergency, rethinking potentially our relationship with the police due to the ways in which the police have brutalized and harmed communities of color, especially people of color who are disabled or queer or transgender. And when it comes to staff, it means making sure that staff that we're maximizing control over their service environment and minimizing risk. So that could look like offering training on topics like trauma stewardship, mental health first aid, and other things to make sure that organization workers have the skills that they need to provide whatever services that they need to for their communities, but that they also know what life skills might be helpful for them to ensure that they feel safe in their workplace. Trustworthiness means decisions are conducted with transparency, with the goals of building trust and maintaining trust with patrons and among staff. So patrons know and trust personal info to be kept confidential, organization rules and policies are clearly communicated and equitably enforced, that there is transparent decision-making processes at all levels, that there's opportunity for individuals to share feedback, and really constantly building trust, knowing that trust is a finite resource. It takes a lot to build and it can be diminished so quickly. And so it's thinking about how we can give folks full and accurate information, telling people what's going on and what's likely to happen next, being clear, right? So that people can feel a stronger sense of control. The third tenet is empowerment, voice, and choice. So throughout the organization and among the patrons served, individual strengths and experiences are recognized and built upon. I struggle with the language around empowerment because I typically, as interpreted, empowerment means giving power to someone and making someone stronger or more confident. And this notion of empowerment for me creates an uneven relationship. You possess the power that can make someone who is in a subordinate position feel more confident, right? And it also implies benevolence, that you are kind and generous enough to share your power. And so instead of asking ourselves, how can I empower this person? I think the question should be, how can I remove the barriers for this person to thrive, right? We all have innate power, but because of our personal identities and because of the ways in which systems of oppression work against certain identities, some of that, accessing that power can be very difficult. And so our job isn't to sort of give someone power, it is to ensure that people have the autonomy and the authority to make decisions, right? And so part of that is voice and choice, being able to strengthen staff and participants' experience of choice. So encouraging active participation and decision-making and offering small built-in choices. Recognizing the importance of power differentials and the ways in which certain voices historically have been diminished in voice and choice, and making programming decisions that are led by what our communities actually want and need. And so really focusing on choice, right? Ensuring that throughout the organization, individuals who are part of it, who are interacting with it, have as much choice to do whatever they need and receive whatever that they need. So collaboration and mutuality is the third. And this is promoting collaboration and leveling power differences between staff and patrons and among all organizational staff. So really understanding how power differences, whether it's between staff and patrons, between organizational staff and clerical or housekeeping personnel, or from professional staff, quote unquote, to administrators, understanding that healing happens, growth happens in relationships and in the meaningful sharing of power and decision making. So creating avenues for both patrons and staff to share and contribute feedback, as well as partnering with local community organizations to create community relevant and culturally responsive offerings. And then the last is cultural, historical, and gender issues. So recognizing and addressing historical trauma and incorporating policies, protocol, and processes that are actually culturally responsive. So this could look like having gender inclusive bathrooms that are available with clear signage, applying universal design principles with an intersectional lens, and consulting and compensating or partnering with culturally specific organizations. So really moving past our stereotypes and our bias to ensure that we are addressing historical trauma, incorporating that understanding into our policies, and also recognizing and responding to the diversity and needs and experiences of our patrons and our staff. This is an example of how a trauma-informed approach specifically to engaging community. I'm sort of providing you a framework of what trauma is, a trauma-informed approach, and then it in application. And the goal of this organization is an organization, I believe, based in San Francisco. They wanted to develop an alternative to traditional community building models because the principles and strategies weren't reflected of the stresses of the residents that were living in their communities. And so they created this framework to think about how we can critically and holistically apply a trauma-informed approach to interacting with the communities that they serve. And so the model looks like this. They have their own principles, which you see some of those principles are similar to the trauma-informed care approach principles, but these are their own specifically for the TICB model. So understanding social justice as well as structural inequity, committing to doing no harm, to not re-traumatizing, acceptance, community power, and sustainability, understanding that when programs start and stop, that can be traumatic, right? When there's lack of continuity, that can cause and activate trauma. And so part of their strategies for then taking those principles are through engaging in community-driven research, so community-based participatory research, which meets the community where they are, right, and asks questions alongside community members to come up with solutions and ideas that really are going to be mutually beneficial. Peer-to-peer approaches, so allowing peers to work together. So some models are this, or I've seen are peer, I forget what they're called. Denver Public Library had them, the peer navigators, who are then able to engage with community different ways because they have that shared lived experience. Creative personal expression and placemaking, and through grief work, emotional support, and restorative justice, knowing that we can't just sort of bypass trauma and get to healing without doing that work. And so some of the practices that they have sort of operationalized based on the principles and based on the strategies are some of these key aspects that show up in the programs that they run. So acknowledging the harm that is done and this commitment to promoting ongoing critical consciousness, honoring history and celebrating culture, never over promising, right? Because part of some of the trauma that some communities experience is a history of broken promises. So being mindful in terms of and being realistic in terms of what can and cannot happen. Making community growth and accomplishments visible. So fostering the belief that healing is possible by making visible counter narratives, by making visible community strengths and the positive efforts made by community members to promote change, ensuring consistency. Like I said, trauma can feel that there is a lack of stability if things are constantly shifting, and ensuring that there's consistent programming, ensuring that there's consistent communication can help alleviate that and can help ensure that there isn't ongoing feelings of distrust or ongoing confusion. Supporting clear and meaningful community engagement structures. So thinking about what already exists in the community and doing our best to support that work instead of recreating the wheel, right? Ensuring that we're not tokenizing individuals or community organizations, and that we want to really ensure that we're developing intentional relationships, right? Not superficial and name only. Promoting safety, which we've talked about, ensuring that regardless of whatever program we're engaged in, regardless of whatever environment at work that we're in, that we are doing our best to ensure the safety of the participants in that space, knowing that we can't ensure at all times that everyone is feeling safe, but we want to do our best to make sure that people feel safe enough, right? So that's thinking about things like location, time of day, modes of transportation, and other things that go into planning for programs. Removing participation barriers. So again, thinking about how do we remove the things that get in the way of people accessing our services or accessing our programs or our resources. So again, considering time of day, location, format of meetings, right? If we can provide incentives, if there can be food or childcare made available, all of these things are going to be a trauma-informed way of ensuring that we're actively building with our community. Providing compensation if we're asking things of our communities, making sure that all sources of expertise are valued and not only traditional, quote unquote, experts are compensated right, knowing that if community members are dedicating their time and energy to community building activities, right, that they should be compensated in some way for their participation. Fostering social cohesion, so forming bonds between residents in our communities, thinking about how social support is a core coping and healing strategy that can help combat some of the impacts of trauma, and ensuring that there is a reflective process. So building in a process or system for ongoing reflection on current events and experiences allows for there to be a conscious and continual sort of improvement mechanism where we can adjust to community needs as they arise. So, sort of in summation, the underlying question is we are moving from what is wrong with you to what has happened to you and what might you need, right? We know that when we see signs of trauma, when we see certain behaviors that could be considered problematic or disruptive, that it's important to interpret those as adaptations to traumatic events, right? Or adaptations to being dysregulated. And that healing happens in relationships. So it's always important for us to think about how can we strengthen the relationships that exist across our organization and in communities of people that we serve. So I'll stop there. I know I didn't leave a ton for a ton of time for question and answer, and I didn't dive deeper into the how do we take care of ourselves while we're doing this. I'm going to integrate that into the next session so we can really spend time with it. I don't want to rush that aspect, but this is an overview of what trauma is, how it can manifest, and then how we can respond to it. And the next time we'll think about, okay, with this understanding, how can we ensure that we're prioritizing wellness and healing in all that we do as individuals and at an organization communal level.